So in this period, this is the period of I'm going to call it the period English novel, right? So this is the time of Pride and Prejudice and, Emma and some of these stories that keep getting made and remade. Jane Austen, right, is writing in this period. And, romantic writers, this period also the, this period was also known as the Romantic period in England. They emphasize, the maiden who dies for love, or the one who had a hard heart, um, that kept the person that loved her from loving her, from up close, just loved her from afar. So um, it's interesting because women in this period of time thought it was distinctly almost unstylish to be in good health, which is weird. So, um, circles under the eyes were cultivated, and the powdered pale look was really important. And you know, the middle class woman, middle class and above, was expected to be perfectly ladylike, right? They were the hostess with the mostest, right? They were for them, their they were very limited in their activities, right? The home was a center of entertainment. They served as hostesses for their world revolved around teas and lunches and visiting, formal visiting, right? You just don't stop by, you make a call. Whereas, you know, working women, the non-affluent, um, saw that move towards industrialization, where the location of business was really in workplaces away from the home, right? So, middle class families in rural areas and women pioneers, um, toiled and did a wide variety of tasks, whereas the more affluent, spent their time, sewing and embroidering and sketching and painting or decorating, almost, I don't want to say doing silly, um, non-stimulating things. Not that they're not. They're not silly and non-stimulating, but they have the appearance of being that, right? Um, but when you compare that to what working class and rural women wore, and like I said, in those pioneers, you know, their garments were more practical, right? Obviously made from less expensive fabrics, but more practical. So basic lines and silhouettes for working class women, and oftentimes their dress um, mimicked what affluent women wore, but just in a more practical manner. And I say that when we think about, farm and pioneer women wearing a sunbonnet, right? You can all, you've watched Little House on the Prairie, right? You've all seen a woman in a sunbonnet, and that is just a transfer, that is just an adaptation of these really ornate bonnets that, fashionable women wore that really did, cover the face, but were practical for, rural farming and pioneer women, because it really protected their face from the heat and the sun. So in even in what each class wore, there were some similarities. They were just adapted to different types of use. Okay, so as we get to this period, really men really couldn't compete any longer with women in the area of fashion. And women's clothing in comparison to men was more complicated and really just more subject to change. And while fashionable French women stopped wearing corsets at the turn of the century, the average woman didn't give her a corset, right? She just put her corset on over her chemise. And the chemise, of course, was still, linen or cotton. It was cut full, straight from the neck to the knees, short set-in sleeves, square neck. And again, the corset, which we also know was known as a stay, were, cut straight in a straight line without the waistline indentation, and just, push your boobs up and out, right? Push your breasts ups and out. So, um, Oftentimes, women still complained. They were still disgruntled, but they wore it. They still wore it. One of the other things that changed is that sometimes women place their petticoat over their chemise, and you know, poor women and African slaves really often wore their petticoat in a combination as an outward garment, as actually their street clothes. So if we look at this image, we see that the skirts, narrow, undergarments really were still straight cut, and skirts widened as we get to the end of this period. But the other thing, we can't see it in this image, but pantalettes. Women started wearing pantalettes, and pantalettes are, you'll have the image when I describe what they are. They're white straight drawers trimmed with rows of lace at the hem. So there was something that originally grown women wore, but ultimately young girls wore them throughout this and subsequent periods. Women also continued with the padded rolls at the back of the waistline of their dresses to add some some stuff, some width, some breadth to it. And really in this period, super thin still was classified as poor. So women wanted to have the appearance of being well fed, even though they didn't want to look healthy. I know there are contradictions, but some of the other garments that women wore, which is the images are here, dresses that had an elaborate decoration on it. These were known as rounded gowns. They're really just a tunic dress that had an underdress that was placed beneath it, but that was gathered at the bust. Also, the image at the top has what is known as a high stomacher dress. So the construction was a little bit complicated, where the bodice was only sewn to the skirt and on one side, and the front seams were often left open. So these are some of the garments. The most common types of sleeves were short and puffed, or fitted. So it was some variations. It's the first time that we really see variation in short, puffed, or fitted, right? They're different types of sleeves, or they were a combination of both. So the image that we see on the bottom, the white and red dress, she has a puff shoulder and then a really fitted sleeve, whereas the image on the top, she has a fitted sleeve all the way down. So, necklines varied. Sometimes they were high, sometimes they were low. We do just see a big variation in what women wore across across the spectrum. One of the other things that we see too is we see the outerwear that men and women wear at this time. This is the one thing that they still kind of had in common. The jacket was known as a Spencer jacket. It was both worn by men and women, and it just ended right at the waistline for them both. So Spencers wore indoors and outdoors, and they were there's a story, of course. There's always a story, right? There's a story, and there's a couple different stories. But one of the stories is that Lord Spencer in England made a bet with a friend that he could start a new fashion within 2 weeks, and he just cut off the coattails of his coat and started wearing it around town. And because of who he was able to start this new fashion. Another version says that Lord Spencer was standing too close to open fire at a party, and his coattails caught on fire, and after the fire was extinguished, he just cut off the rest and he started a new fashion. And then finally that he was thrown from his horse, and in the accident his coattails were torn off, and because he wanted to continuing the race that he was in, he just kept on wearing a short coat. So, all these stories could be true. One of these stories could be true, or none could be true. Regardless, men and women started wearing the Spencer coat as their outer garment. Okay, so if we move on to the next period of time in this 50-year period. We see some more changes, right? So we do see a transition from the Empire period to the Romantic period, and really that the change that happened is the change of the waistline, right? And it took gradually. So the waistline moved from being right under the bust, if you think about the previous image that we looked at, being directly under the bust line, to several inches above the location of the waist. So kind of it's moving down to the waist. It's not there yet. It's moving down though. So really that waistline placement what was the change. Also the development of sleeves, which are going to grow larger and larger as we move on in this period, and we also will see a widening of skirts that eventually become a little bit shorter. So undergarments continue to be the chemise and drawers, stays, petticoats. Chemises though became a little wider, and they continue to have a short sleeve. But the other thing that was introduced was the bustle. And the bustle were small down or cotton fill pads that tied around the waist and held your skirt out in the back. So the bustle was a definite change, the image that we see here of the woman in the pinkish or red dress, depending on what your coloring is on your screen, is wearing a dress, evening dress, which shows the transition in the placement. So we see the waistline has moved down a little bit lower. The skirt is more bell-shaped and it's ornamented around the hem with some rich embroidery, and the sleeves are beginning to get a little bit bigger. For the regular women, dresses were frequently identified in fashion magazines according to the time of day for which they were intended. So as a result, fashionable women, had different types of items, right? So they had what was known as a morning dress or a day dress or a walking or promenade dress. They may have, a dinner dress, evening or ball dresses, right? So we use these words. We use these words now, but morning dresses were generally the most informal. They were made of lingerie type fabrics such as white cotton linen or fine lace ruffles, and we see a very ornate version of a morning dress here. Whereas day dresses or walking dresses or carriage dresses were really just indistinguishable from each other, whereas the morning dress really was. And continuing, daytime dresses had that lower waistline. They had wide sleeves and a full skirt. Necklines varied, but V shape, square shape, high neck, still just continued. Again, there was a big differentiation of sleeves, and this is the time where they were just exceptionally diverse, and fashion periodicals gave many different names to the slides that they showed. And under this section of the lecture, there is a list of the different names for the different types of sleeves that were represented. So again, more changes, and we're not even done yet, right? We're only at 1835, and we still have 15 more years to go in this period. So if we look at the garments here, you see that they're very different. So the garments on the left are what is known. The garment in the furthest back with the woman with the bonnet is what's known as a pelisse, and a pelisse it's just a type of dress that was it was similar to what we would wear as a modern coat. So if we look at the one in the back, it's actually an outer garment. Um, and um, and then it transformed. It's just not from an outer garment to a daytime dress. And for the one in the front, the one that we see closest to us, the name was given police robe. That was just an adaptation. So it was kind of a kind of a coat dress. Um, it closed down with button and ties, and sometimes they were hidden in the back with hook and eyes. And you know, if we see the image here, they're made in fashionable colors, colors at the time, and they were made from popular fabrics, muslins and printed cottons, and sometimes they were made out of silks and wools. And evening dresses, on the other hand, differed greatly from what was worn in the daytime. So the images that we see on the right hand side are more daytime, everyday dresses, whereas the ones to the left are just much more going out to visit, right? When you're entertaining, this is what you will wear when you're entertaining on the left, and on the right is what you would wear as your day dress, your promenade, your walking around dress. And then we get to the end. We get to the end of this, this 50-year period, and we look at the garment that is here, and we see that the silhouette of dresses gradually became just really more subdued. The change in sleeve shaping, there had really been balloons that started to deflate. We looked at those last sleeves on the previous slide compared to this one. And although the fullness of the sleeve didn't completely disappear, it just moved lower down onto the arm. And eventually, by the time we get to the end of this period, sleeves become narrower and closely fitted. So again, we get back to the floor length, right? So in the previous period, we did get to see some ankle, some calf, but in this period, we're back to the floor length, garment, right? The result really in these changes were while they were subtle, it moved from a feeling of lightness, lightness in what you were wearing to feeling much heavier, almost drooping, having a drooping quality. And again, if we look at this bodice, we see we are now at the waist, right? So bodices now ended at the waist, and came to be, the focal point of the garment, right? So garments were able to hook and close with buttons or laces or something down the back. And this, since we're at the waist now, this gave the ability to have a two-piece garment, right? So when you have something that ends at the waist, it ends right underneath your breast or a few inches above your normal waist, it's really a one-piece garment. But when you can actually, start a garment at your waist, there were some two-piece jacket and skirt styles. There were some, front buttoning jackets. One popular style is known as the gilet corsage, and it's just an imitation of a man's waistcoat. Of course, the French were the ones that did that as well. And there was just a softening, right? A softening of what women wore. So if we look at the image that we have here, this is an evening dress that has a dip, at the neckline. It's edged in large lace. It has some flounces on the skirt. And the interesting thing in this period too, lace technology had come around so that lace could actually be machine made. So it definitely was was more worn. One of if we look at this garment too, it was what's known as a Victoria sleeve, which had a puff, a kind of a flounce at the elbow. We see that it's a sleeve with an oversleeve on it. Sometimes it could have an epaulette if had more of a shoulder on it. But we do see that, really a fitted bodice, a much widening funnel or bell shape garment. We see a lot of lace and embroidery trim, since again there was a technology to do that. And we just see this shape of the skirt is just full and gathered into the waist. So it is a drastic change. Over this period, we've seen slim silhouettes, we've seen bouffant silhouettes, and now we're back to seeing more of the bell shape silhouette. So we do definitely see a change over this 50-year period in what women wore.